Welcome to today's webinar entitled, What the Heck is Going On with the Economy? My name is Andrew Cardozo and I'm president of the Pearson Center, and I will moderate this discussion. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Center is headquartered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and we welcome our speakers and audience who are joining us from across Turtle Island. And I will say, as we think about issues of reconciliation these days while the Pope was visiting Canada, it's time to give those issues a bit more thought as these during this week. As you may know, the Pearson Center, established 9 years ago, is the only think tank that really brings together wide cross sections of Canadians from all 5 political parties, from business, labor, NGOs, and various other interests. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all our donors and the sponsors, many of you who are with us today. You make these sessions possible. If you like this kind of event and you're watching this session for the first time, please do feel like you can visit the Pearson Center website, which is thepearsoncentre.ca, and make a donation of your own so that there can be more of these thoughtful events in these turbulent times of change. Just briefly on the format, I will have several questions for the panel for about 40 minutes. Then we will take questions from you, the audience. So please use the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can. We will end at 11:30 Eastern Time. Now, to our panel of outstanding economic thinkers in Canada, we are so fortunate to have them today join us in the midst of this rapidly changing global economic situation, or maybe turmoil is the word, as they help us understand the uncertainty that is all around us. Angella MacEwen is senior economist at the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, before which she was chief economist at the Canadian Labour Congress. She's also a policy fellow at the Broadbent Institute. Professor Ian Lee is at the Sprott School of Business, Carleton University. He has taught university in many countries, including Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Cuba, and the United States. He's also much sought after by the media, so we are grateful that he could find time in his schedule to join us today. Professor Karim Bardeesy is co-founder and executive director of the Leadership Lab, located at the office of the Deputy Provost and Vice Provost at Toronto Metropolitan University. He came to our attention with his promotion of the ideas of economic dignity. Now, Angella MacEwen and Ian Lee have been on the Pearson podium before, and we welcome you back. This is the first time for Karim Bardeesy, and we welcome you to the Pearson as a Pearson rookie for the first time. I will add that each of our panelists have a political involvement or political past. Ian Lee was a progressive conservative candidate federally in about 1993. Is that right, Ian?
Right.
Yes.
But I'm no longer involved with any political party, but I was a candidate a third of a century ago.
There is a background there. Angella MacEwen ran for the New Democratic Party federally in the last 2 federal elections, and Karim Bardeesy is the most recent political candidate. He ran in the provincial election that just took place earlier this spring. So let me start. So I just want to mention those things. I'm not expecting that our panelists will speak as candidates or members of the political party, but I think it's interesting that we have people with a number of different perspectives. So let me start with the question, a general question I have for you, and I'll start with you, Ian Lee. I think if we look at what's happening in the world today, the 2 major global disruptions that have happened since 2020 are COVID, since the beginning of 2020, and the war in Ukraine since February of this year. Is it fair to say that they're the main cause of most of the upheaval that we see today?
I certainly won't disagree with the 2 you identified. Just to come back to the political for a moment, I don't belong to any political party. I don't donate money. I don't allow lawn signs. I admire people that get involved in the political process, but I certainly don't consult privately with conservatives or any political party about these views. They're my own views. I've developed teaching for the last 35 years and researching this subject. I'm a former commercial banker before I went back for my PhD. I was 9 years throughout the 70s, early 80s, where I lent millions and millions of dollars in mortgage loans, demand loans, consumer loans, and business revolving lines of credit. I was with Avco Finance and the Bank of Montreal, so I was 9 years in commercial banking. And so I have a very deep interest and experience in that whole area of the economy, credit. And so now to your point, I don't disagree at all with the two you identified, but I think you must put two more meta events, if I can call it that, above surrounding this. Number one is the demographic collapse that has occurred, not just in Canada, but across the world, in much of the world. Daryl Bricker and John Ibbotson of the Globe and Mail wrote a wonderful, beautiful book called Empty Planet. We are depopulating. And so we are now facing the demographic collapse and massive labor shortages, not because of COVID, but because the birth rate went from 4 in the 50s, when my mother had 4 children, bang on the national average, and it's now 1.4, way below the break even. And so we're going to have labor shortages long after we've forgotten the word COVID. It's going to run for a half a century or more. The second major event as background to this is the shortage of new housing construction to keep up with the desperately, urgently needed immigration. And that's been going on for at least 10 years, probably since 2000 or thereabouts. We can quibble. So those two factors were internal, inside Canada. I'm not saying there weren't labor shortages in other countries, but there are labor shortages in Canada because the birth rate has collapsed in Canada, and we are not keeping up with construction. And then, yes, the illegal, horrible invasion of a sovereign country by Putin and Russia, and COVID did interrupt the supply chains that were mostly constructed on a JIT, just-in-time inventory system, where you had very small levels of inventory. It didn't matter what industry. You kept small levels because inventory is very costly. Sitting there 30 days of inventory at a GM plant, the inventory can get damaged. And so they learned through Toyota and lean manufacturing to become very tight, very efficient, you know, a day, 2 days of inventory. And this went on across industries, not just manufacturing. Food, everything. And so it's great when everything works. And then you break it up, and what happens when you break it up is you interrupt the supply chain, is that it's much harder to bring it back online, so to speak. It will get there. It's probably gonna, I agree with Governor Macklem, it'll be another couple of years. It will come back into balance, but right now that's the fourth. So 2 of these are domestic and 2 of them are international.
Right, right. Thank you. Angela, your thoughts on the disruptions created by these 2 major events and any others?
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely agree that these are the 2 main things, and the supply chains are arguably COVID, right? Because we've outsourced all of our manufacturing. And all of the stuff that we buy, a lot of the stuff that we buy and build is built around the world. And it's not just in one place, it's in multiple places. So we have value chains that are quite complicated. And so COVID shut that down and made that more difficult. So absolutely, that's a problem. But along with that, there has been market concentration in a lot of sectors. So we've got 2 chip manufacturers provide over 70% of the semiconductor chips. And we don't do any of that manufacturing in North America anymore. And so it becomes much more difficult when that market concentration is behind the supply chains as well. And we've also seen, I think, inequality. So I would agree with Professor Lee that there is demographic change behind some of the labor shortages that we're seeing, but it's not demographic. I would not say demographic collapse. I would not be quite so energetic about it, but I would say that there's change. If you look at in 2005, about 55% of our population was core working age between 24 and 55. And now it's only 48%. So we've had a slow decline over that time when the baby boomers are getting to be over 65 now, and we know that labor force participation falls as people get over 55, and then it falls off a cliff after 65, of course, because people deserve, you know, a decent retirement and security. So there are a whole bunch of other economic fault lines around that COVID and the war in Ukraine exacerbated, I think. So we're trying to shift off fossil fuels, but all of a sudden it becomes very, very urgent that Europe needs more fossil fuels because they haven't shifted enough far away. So they still need some. So they're bringing coal back online. So these two big things, I think, the housing crisis, we haven't been building enough purpose-built rental housing. We've financialized housing in such a way that it was a crisis. It's not that we're not building enough houses. We are actually, but we're not building affordable houses for people. So how we financialized housing has been a real problem, and how we haven't built affordable low-income housing for people. So we have a homelessness crisis alongside of this, right? So I think those are the two big drivers that then have exacerbated other economic trends that we've seen around.
Okay, thank you. Karim, Bardeesy, what are your thoughts on these two major international disruptions?
Yeah, I would endorse those plus the impacts that are being talked about, and I would also endorse the two added ones that Professor Lee mentioned. I'll maybe take an angle on this question that speaks to, I think that a key part of the upheaval that we haven't really, it's going to take some time to understand are two key consequences to maybe talk about with these upheavals are the differential ability to access credit and the role that leverage is playing in these. So a lot of the phenomena that Angela and Ian were talking about are exacerbated by credit being either highly available for those who already have assets to find more leverage opportunities, or people who don't have much access to credit, but they're not able to participate in the labor market in a way that rewards them, because COVID has denigrated social networks, has denigrated that ability to progress in a profession for lots of people. And you see lots of speculation, even by people who don't have access to credit. Interesting to see the rise in interest in crypto assets for large swaths of the population. I think estimates are anywhere from 15 to 30% of Canadians have some sort of exposure to crypto assets, which is really remarkable. And I wouldn't underestimate, frankly, the role of casino gambling and sports betting. So you're seeing there's a shadow economy that's happening that is perhaps a result of some of these things. The other consequence I think is important, credit, but also the damage to the damage and the scarring to the labor force. People are not able to participate in the economy the way they used to. Other people who have expectations around the kind of what the economy used to provide for them, the kind of services that used to be able to be provided, and the labor force not being able to provide that, and that's both in the private and the public economy. We've heard a lot about healthcare workers and healthcare fatigue, but we see it obviously clearly in the private sector economy as well in some sectors where the labor challenges are acute. I see this on the front line as a teacher, and I'll be looking forward to hearing from my students in the fall and winter on this, but hearing the extent to which people are less and less likely to see their chosen paths that they're already on as being the ones that will actually give them the kind of financial cushion and career that they expect, and they're increasingly looking elsewhere for economic opportunity.
Yeah, and can you just say a little bit about the concept of economic dignity that you've been writing about and talking about?
Yeah, for sure. And this is something it's originally in the original piece was by Gene Sperling in a journal called Democracy, Journal of Ideas, which he later expanded into a book. And in our parties, now taking off my Toronto Metropolitan University hat and wearing a bit of a partisan hat, our party provincially in the last election made as a keystone of its economic platform the concept of helping create economic dignity and instilling economic dignity through a system that ensures that in a variety of ways that an honest, what you might call, this is an old-fashioned term, but an honest day's work helps support people in their life, and that there's a floor there, and that work is not something that doesn't help you build a life. And so, what are the supports that governments, public policy, and the private sector employers can put in around that? And this is everything from more paid sick leave to a higher minimum wage to portable benefits packages, so that it's not just people with full-time jobs who have access to benefits, full-time jobs in established employers. And so it's one concept of economic dignity it's the next evolution of the social safety net. It includes a concept of extending the benefits that many unions are able to provide through their collective bargaining into as yet non-unionized sectors. Angela has a lot of experience, like the CLC agenda on this was very strong, and I commend both people in the union and in the business sector who are already thinking about these issues. And so we and I have been looking a lot about what is going to be needed to invite people into the economy. I'm really worried about the attraction of, until recently, very cheap debt and alternative economic models that are attracting people, especially young people, so they think it might be better worth their time to invest in crypto or try to find work as a social media influencer, try to find those winner-take-all opportunities that actually don't share the wealth. And the fact is that if everyone thinks they're in a winner-takes-all economy, they're going to be sadly mistaken, because there are not that many winners in a winner-takes-all economy. It is a very small proportion of people who actually are the winners in those economies.
Yeah. Angela, did you want to add anything on the economic dignity approach?
I mean, those are all things, as the professor noted, that the labor movement fights for, and we fight for it in terms of our own members, but also in terms of labor law changes and making sure that everybody has paid sick leave. And it's really quite shocking to me that at this point in the pandemic, Ontario has three paid days of sick leave for the whole time, the whole 2 years. So you could only have gotten sick for 3 days and had it paid. And it was important before the pandemic, but it was absolutely critical to make sure that people could afford to isolate. And it's something that I'm really disappointed that we haven't moved further on at the provincial level. I mean, no province has met the bar that we need to be at.
Yeah. Professor Lee, can I ask you, there's a series of issues I'd like to go through the panel with now in terms of some of the specific issues that are of concern in the economy, and between the three of you, you've touched on all of them, so I just want to delve down a bit deeper. Professor Lee, I'll start with you on the matter of labor shortages. As you say, this has been something that's been coming for a while. Did it all get did the pandemic speed up that cliff that we thought was going to be a slow reduction in the workforce, and make a lot of people suddenly think, I've had enough, I'm out of here, I'm 60-ish and I'm done? Is that what happened with COVID, that it all happened a lot faster than was expected?
I think it accelerated it, but it didn't cause the labor shortages. I have to disagree with Angela about the demographic numbers. If you look at that book from Ibbotson, I'm not basing it on that. If you look at demographic forecasts around the world, every region of the world is depopulating with the exception of Africa. Japan is going to lose, and I'm just using Japan very quickly. It's the most extreme case. I'm cherry picking. They're going to lose 30 to 40 million Japanese are going to vanish. In other words, the population is going to contract. China is estimated to contract by, some say 300 million, some say 400 million. And if you look at StatsCan, they said we would be contracting if it wasn't for immigration. In other words, 100% of our population growth is based on immigration. I'm a strong supporter of immigration, but StatsCan has been saying for years, immigration is not enough. It's not going to solve our labor shortages. And Angela's statistic about the participation is correct. But remember, we're only at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. We're not at the end. We're not at the beginning of the end. We're not in the middle. 1/3 of the boomers are still in the workforce as I speak, and I am Exhibit A. I'm past 65 and I'm not retiring. So my point is, you fast forward 5 or 10 years, not a million years or not 100 years, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse, the labor shortages. That's good news and bad news, because as Professor Goodall from the London School of Economics has argued, is that the inequality of the past 50 years, which was essentially, he argues, way too many workers and not enough jobs and high unemployment as a consequence, is going to flip to massive labor shortages. I tell my own students, you've got phenomenal opportunities for the rest of your life. People are going to be bidding for you. You're going to get multiple job offers. It's going to drive up wages. And he argues inequality is going to go down because employers are going to be forced to pay higher wages for the labor that they need. And he isn't saying this is because of COVID. He's arguing this is the demographic revert. He calls it the Great Demographic Reversal, is the name of his book, on analyzing this. And he's saying something quite similar to Berker and Ibbotson, that we are seeing an unprecedented reversal. I mean, the world has been growing for every year for 1,000 years. Canada's growing every year from the beginning. And now countries are looking at shrinking. Italy is going to shrink. France is probably going to shrink. This is unprecedented. And so it's going to change everything. It's going to change our income support policies, our social policies, and the way we look at the economy and economic growth. And so we're looking at changes that are going to be far beyond COVID. And 5, 10 years from now, when we've long forgotten about COVID, these labor shortages are going to be there.
Yeah, now, what also occurs to me is you've got a number of seniors who may want to retire but can't retire because they can't afford to. They don't have the pension supports. Do we need, as well as we're facing labor shortages, to be looking at more ways in which seniors can work, perhaps more part-time? And in terms of equality, are we looking at, for example, the hiring more people with disabilities? Indigenous people, racialized people, is that part of equality going to reduce too, do you see?
Going to your first part of your question, the OECD has been arguing for at least 10 or 15 years, at least, that we should be raising the minimum pensionable age of retirement. They've argued it should go to 67 and eventually higher. They have said it's unsustainable. Now, they're talking mostly the European countries. Let's be fair. They're not pointing the finger at Canada. We have a hybrid pension system, unlike the Europeans, which is essentially a purely state system. And but the point is, I'm not getting into whether we can afford it or not afford it. If you have a central printing press, I don't think it's a big issue because you can print money at the end of the day as a sovereign nation with a central bank. But to your question, if we are facing massive labor shortages, surely we should be saying, how can we get more people in the workforce by keeping older people in the workforce and attracting non-traditional people, indigenous people, marginalized people, disabled people? I mean, my phrase is, we need all hands on deck. And I said that before the House of Commons Finance Committee in March of this year. I said, instead of coming up with programs to incentivize people to remain home, we should be giving incentives for people to return to work. And not because we're trying to save money on the deficit. That's not the issue. The issue is, we've learned that, as Chrystia Freeland herself said, we're all in it together. I'm dependent on the people showing up at Loblaws and stocking the shelves so I can buy groceries. And the people at Loblaws that work there are dependent on me showing up to work and teaching their children, and so on and so on and so on. We need more people in the workforce from everywhere, from all walks.
Then maybe employers should raise wages.
I agree.
Yeah, we haven't. The reason people aren't working is because they can't afford to. So I've done an analysis by sector of labor force, so-called labor force shortages. And in many sectors, if you look at food services and accommodations, it's because they're not getting enough hours. Workers can't piece together enough hours to make ends meet. The wage has gone up a little bit, not keeping pace with inflation even, but they're not getting enough hours. In other sectors, they're not getting wage increases. In healthcare and education, they're getting 1%. Inflation this year is going to be 8%. So yes, COVID accelerated older Women especially, if you look at the demographics, it's women over 55 that mostly didn't come back to the labor force after COVID. Their jobs were tough, they weren't being respected, and they're like, you know what, it's it, I'm done, let's go. And so that temporary shortage in healthcare and education is partly because those women left the labor force, but the ongoing shortage is going to be because we don't pay them enough to do the job that they're doing. And provinces across Canada right now are offering 1% and 2% wage increases for those workers, and they're not hiring enough people, so they're running short-staffed, and people are getting burnt out and leaving the profession. So the healthcare profession, I'm really worried about that. In terms of
But Andrew,
yeah.
can I just jump in? And I don't want to monopolize this because I'm sure Karim has some views on this. I looked at the latest StatsCan analysis of the vacancies, and it's affecting all the sectors. Construction's the #1. It's not healthcare. Yes, healthcare is being okay. I agree with Angela, but it's not just healthcare. It's not just restaurants.
But there's vacancies and there's vacancies, right?
And secondly, we have the lowest unemployment rate in recorded history. So this isn't a question of there's all kinds of angry people sitting at home. We don't have enough bodies in the workforce.
That's not true. It really isn't, Ian. That's not true.
StatsCan data
because if it were true, wages would be going up, and they're not.
I mean,
no,
you've heard
they're not.
But they are. They weighed up 4% in the last StatsCan.
Real wages are going down by 4 or 5%. Average real wages.
In the last NPR report showed wages, nominal wages across Canada went up 4.
But nominal wages don't matter.
I know.
Just let Angela go for a minute and then come back to Professor Lee. Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, when you're taking a 5% real wage cut and you're looking at rents are going up right now, gas is going up to get to work, and you're still, actually, there are lots of people, Ian's talking about paying people to stay home, but there are lots of people who still are vulnerable to COVID and they can't go to work because it's not safe. We only just got the vaccine available for under 5s, and they haven't gotten it yet. Right? So if you've got a vulnerable kid, you've got kids under 5, you can't go to work full time. So COVID still is a factor in these labor force shortages. And we are seeing increasing automation. We're seeing increasing ability actually to reduce our reliance on people. So we're adjusting both with automation and with bringing people in. And the thing that I'm really worried about is increasing inequality, because the quick way to solve this problem at the low end of the labor market is to bring in more temporary foreign workers under the temporary foreign worker program and have them do agriculture, fisheries, and personal support workers. And then we don't pay those workers enough. That suppresses wages, that suppresses their ability. They are reliant on one employer, so they can't, if they happen to get a bad employer, they can't switch jobs and they can't report it if it's unsafe work because they'll be sent home. And so it really matters how we need to be thoughtful about how we deal with this and strategic. And as as Ian and I were talking, I said there's shortages and there's shortages. So healthcare right now, people aren't getting the care that they need because we don't have enough healthcare workers. Healthcare workers are being burnt out because they're the only nurse on a shift. They're the only care worker that was not sick, right? We're closing down emergency rooms in Ontario, right?
We have a lot of people.
We could be building another house if we had more construction workers. There are nice to have more construction workers, but there's still lots of construction workers at work, houses getting built. They could do more if they had more workers, but they're actually doing they're at capacity. So there's and people can't, there's lots of vacancies for restaurants, but they're not paying people enough or offering people enough hours. So that's why those vacancies aren't being filled. Okay. So we really need to think about strategically what is happening.
Yeah. Professor Lee, quick comment, and then I want to hear from.
I mean, there's truth on both sides. I mean, first off, the Liberal government, and I fully support them on this, they've announced the full phase out of income support because they said the numbers do not warrant further income. I'm talking emergency. Of course we have income support. It's called unemployment insurance. It was passed in 1935, for goodness sake, and nobody ever suggested, and I have never suggested, getting rid of social assistance or income support or the traditional programs that we have had. Quick stat for everybody. The year before COVID, the Government of Canada, StatsCan showed the whole of accounting stats. Federal and provincial governments spent $500 billion in 1 year on the big three of social policy: income support, writ large, healthcare, education. Those are the holy three. I call it the holy trinity of social policy. $500 billion is 25% of GDP. That's a lot of money, and that was pre-COVID. So we're doing a lot. We should be doing a lot. There's people that need help. Of course we should, but we're talking about the phasing out of these special measures that Chrystia Freeland announced back in March 2021, 2020 and 2021. Those are being phased out because she's saying, and I think there's a large number of economists, not all, that say that, look, all the jobs have been recovered. If you look at the total number of jobs lost and all the jobs are recovered plus. So yes, there's problems in the workforce. Yes, there's wage problems at the low end. I completely agree with you, Angela. And the market, look at Amazon. They're pushing up their wages to $20 and $22 because they have no choice. The market is forcing them to. So if they're being underpaid, then the market is going to be forcing these companies to pay more, or they will go to business because they won't have workers to run their business.
Okay, Professor Bardeesy, you get a word in at last.
There's a lot here. One thing I think it feels like we don't know is that I'd like to know more about is the ability of employees who are not in bargain sectors, what their choices are. Are the vacancies being explained by them seeking out higher wage opportunities, or by them absenting themselves from the labor force because the backstops are generous, or because, again, don't underestimate the role of alternative investments and the ongoing availability of credit. I don't want to be a boring yes and to both Angela and Ian's points, but I believe that we need to know more about how choices are happening on the margin with in individual labor situations. One thing that this conversation we haven't yet talked much about, but I'll just put on the table, is are Canadians or people in Canada, because we've mentioned temporary foreign workers a few times, showing more willingness to relocate for work or to relocate for other reasons, because that can lead to labor market mismatches and imbalances that might be incidental to or separate from these other very important conversations.
Yes.
And what are the things, is from a public policy perspective, is that something we want to enable or not? I think probably both Ian and Angela and Andrew all might remember Jean Chrétien's remark in a 1997 town hall during the election of 1997, where a woman said that there was not a job somewhere, but there was a job somewhere else. And Chrétien asked somewhat aggressively and flippantly, well, why don't you just move to where that job is? And we don't have a story within Canada about the acceptance of doing that. We don't have great awareness of where the family networks are that support people. So when they do need to want to move to a job, they can. I think it's a really important, interesting question. And another thing to be aware of is if our transportation systems are really choking, that might make mobility within Canada for employment or other purposes more difficult. So you've got an interesting set of choices that individuals are making in their lives as they relate to their bargaining power, their alternative use of that hour that could be spent on useful labor in the labor market, and then mobility questions. Sorry, I have questions, not answers, but those are my reactions.
Okay, good. Well, what I'd like to do is just to go through, let me introduce a novel concept, which is short answers. And I'll just throw a few quick issues at you, and just because there are a whole lot. That's why I just want to do short answers. So on the matter of inflation, which is skyrocketing, what's the cause of it, and when do you see it leveling off, and if so, when? Angela, I'll start with you.
That is the question, isn't it? So I've done a lot of reading about inflation and thinking about inflation and looking at the numbers. And it does seem like inflation in Canada right now, it's not only Canada, it's definitely a global phenomenon. It seems to be caused by, the supply chain issues that we talked about. That's driving up the cost of, say, secondhand cars because we don't have enough chips for new cars. We have the war in Russia, the Russian war in Ukraine, which I think was a surprise and really drove up the cost of commodities, and kind of took inflation. Inflation was kind of, we thought, transitory and maybe okay, and then the war happened and it kind of just accelerated. But then there's also corporate profiteering, which we haven't talked about here, and there's been lots of research around big companies, because there is a lot of oligopolies in Canada. We got a lot of concentration of market power. They're taking the opportunity to increase prices more than they have to cover their costs, and sort of just pass it off as inflation. They'll say, oh, it'll be okay, people will pay more for this. So we see that in actually the gasoline sector. Retailers and wholesalers and all of that are increasing prices more. There's a report from the Toronto Star about the grocery sector, Loblaw in particular. Their profit margins have gone up substantially over the crisis, far more than their costs. And so that's the only one of those three things that we have any control over. And we haven't seen any governments really looking at that. The UK has implemented an excess profit tax. And so that's something that this government could look at doing, even just to discourage these big companies from adding fire. Because what we hear as workers, if we go back to the 70s, it was wages that was partly causing inflation. And so now at the bargaining table, they're telling us, oh no, we can't raise your wages because that'll make inflation worse.
Yeah,
and it's not true. If we get cost of living increases, that doesn't accelerate inflation.
So do you see inflation leveling off sometime in the next?
No, well, I don't see anybody attacking corporate profiteering. I don't see any slowdown on the price of commodities, and supply chains are going to take a couple of years to kind of ease out. So the one thing that raising interest rates might have an impact on is housing prices. That's it.
Yeah. Okay, Karim, quick thought from you on inflation.
I'm not the same expert in the way that Angela has been spending time on it. So I will just observe that government policymakers, distinct from Bank of Canada, but government policymakers have less control over this than even the most aggressive. And I'm a champion. I like a lot of the ideas that Angela's putting on the table. I do wonder if in the near term, because so much of the phenomenon is global, that in any one country that an unusual set of policies would have an unusual effect broadly. But one could imagine a world in which in Canada, the aggressive action helps that tames housing inflation might have impacts elsewhere. But I can't give you a month or a date. Sorry.
Okay. Ian, do you have anything to add in terms of why we have inflation, and do you have a date as to when it's going to slow down? Okay.
I do, and I have to very respectfully disagree with both Angela and Karim. I lived through the 70s. I was at the Bank of Montreal, main office, Ottawa, opposite West Branch, the West building of Parliament Hill, when interest rates hit 20%. Yes, the fact that it's global is completely a red herring, and I'll explain why, and that then points to the solutions. I'm not saying that there isn't multiple countries with multiple high levels of inflation. The Bank of Canada or any central bank's authority extends over the consumers and workers and employees and owners in that country. The Bank of Canada is not trying to influence the interest rate or the inflation rate in Afghanistan or China or Russia. All it cares about is the 38 million people in Canada, because that's its remit, that's its authority. And so what they're trying to prevent is the impact on us in our heads embedding the inflation. That's what they're going to do. And for those who say interest rates don't work, well, I am sorry, I lived through it. And we peaked at 14% inflation in 1979. I was there, I bought my house in 76. And in 3 years, it had gone up. I bought it for 38,000, and well, 8 years later, I sold it for 100. So you can do the math. I mean, the inflation was brutal. And the way, I don't agree with Angela that the wages were causing it. The wages were chasing the prices going up, up, up. The high prices were chasing the high wages, and it was a spiral all the way up. And I don't blame it on the workers. It was both. And so to your point, when is inflation? I believe it's going to come to an end within 2 years because I think, A, the supply chains are slowly coming back into balance because of supply and demand, you know, good old fashioned classical, neoclassical economics. And secondly, interest rates, if you drive them up high enough, work. Now, yes, there's the risk.
They only work if they cause a very severe recession, Ian. That's the only time they've ever worked.
That's
is
not
when
true.
they cause a recession. It is because that pulls back demand.
Yeah,
and
it
allows
does.
reset
But Angela,
unemployment, but it
What does that
causes a
mean?
lot of pain.
you said it will only work if a severe recession is imposed.
That's what happened in the 80s and the 90s.
The Federal Reserve has a new paper out by their staff economists of the last many recessions and interest rates. And they do not need, the only savage recession we had, the worst since the Depression, was the one I lived through in 1980. And there's no question they overshot. But you cannot say that high interest rates will automatically always produce a massively deep recession. It can.
I didn't. That's not what I said, Ian.
Minor recession.
Ian, I said they only work to combat inflation.
They're cooling the economy as we speak. We're not in a recession, and they're cooling the economy as we speak.
Okay, I guess we can agree it's a very delicate balance.
No, but the numbers are in the report, in the NPR from the Bank of Canada. The economy is cooling. House prices are
couple of other questions.
They're still talking about 3 more raises before the end of the year. They're going to overshoot.
And let me get this in, Andrew, because it's very important for everybody who's following us saying, well, okay, who's right, who's wrong? The interest rates right now, as I speak, are still at historically unprecedented levels. I looked up the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England because they go back 250 years. The interest rates of the last 5 years, when we went down to a quarter of 1 point, were never, ever, ever seen before, not even during the Great Depression. So my point being, and Angela even said this earlier, rates were, or else Karim said it, rates were at such a low level, unprecedented, that we're only going back up to normal rates. These aren't the rates of the 1980 when we went to 20%. We're going to be at the end of this year at 3.25% central bank rate, maybe 3.5%. I hope they do. And it's still, these are very low levels of interest rates, and they are cooling the economy as we speak.
Okay, quick questions, quick answers. And I'll just ask each one a different question, and I'm sure you'd all want to jump in, but you're not allowed to. So, a question for Ian Lee on national deficit and debt. You made a comment earlier about you can just print money. I'll just point out there's a political leader who has been attacking the government for printing too much money. What's your thought about national deficit and debt, and should we be printing money?
I want to be a little more nuanced than that. I didn't say you could be printed in profligately like Venezuela or Argentina. There are cases, or Weimar Germany, that did that. I'm talking the OECD countries, the high-income countries that have often run deficits, and it does not bring the country to an end. It does not cause fiscal collapse if you have a central bank authority. Nobel Prizes have been awarded in this subject. The subnational governments called our provinces, that's a different matter, as the PBO has pointed out. Some of the provinces are unsustainable over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I worry about the provinces. I do not worry about the government of Canada. It's the 10th or 11th largest economy in the world, and we have a very strong Bank of Canada, very well-staffed Bank of Canada, and we have a strong economy, a strong GDP, and we have, Angela won't like this, but our inequality is not that bad. We're below the OECD a little tiny bit. We're not going off the charts. And so the economy is fundamentally sound. And so I'm not worried about the government of Canada is not going to fail and is not going to fall into bankruptcy.
Okay, Karim, you had mentioned, thank you, Ian. Karim, you had mentioned cryptocurrency. Your thoughts about where that's going and how stable a part of the economy that might be. And again, I'll mention there's a political leader who's been talking about that as being a major avenue for the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me deeply worrying because of the potential for people to be scammed. There are not yet regimes that seem to be able to guarantee even those the so-called stable coins and other assets that have some peg to some other form of currency or to some other form of reliability. And I know that beyond deposit insured investments, any investment is risky, but I think it's the attraction is sufficient, and the language of currency, which again, these are not currencies, but the language of currency is I think, from what I can tell, deceiving people a little bit. Our think tank, the Leadership Lab, is about to engage in some work on this through our Cybersecure Policy Exchange project. So I hope we can have more to share about this in the coming months. Can I just want to pick up on Professor Lee's point around deficits, if it's okay. Absolutely agree with what he said, but with the following proviso: if our economy nationally continues to be financialized or continues to grow in financialization, if the household balance sheets continue to grow too much, I suspect the current moves are making this mitigating against this. But if household balance sheets continue to inflate, if the real estate asset bubble isn't tamed, then I do worry that the federal government has a bit of risk. But otherwise, I completely agree that it's the really provinces we need to worry about.
Okay, thank you. Angela, a quick thought from you on oil. Gas prices have gone up considerably. You mentioned, and provincial governments some of the provincial governments have reduced their tax on gas. Is that a solution, or do you think that the oil companies can be doing more to reduce their prices?
So yeah, I mean, Professor Ian Lee has talked about the monetary policy report. In the last monetary policy report from the Bank of Canada, they specifically mentioned much higher than usual margins at refineries in Canada, and that was one of the things driving price increases. Yes. So when and in Alberta, there has been analysis now of, so Alberta cut I think 8 cents out of their gas tax, that and they told retailers to make sure that got passed along to consumers. It did initially, but that has completely eroded. That 8 cents is now going into retailer profits. So it's generally a bad idea because you're starving government when it is needing the money to do some of the stuff that we need it to do on climate change, on healthcare, on whatever your priority is. So you're starving the government of its ability to respond to the current crisis, and it's just getting passed on to profits. It doesn't actually get into the consumer pockets.
And whose role is it to challenge the oil and gas companies in terms of their?
Well, I think our regulators need to be challenging them in terms of that. And then I think the other thing that governments need to be doing, it's more of a mid to long-term issue, but gas prices are only going to go up over time. This is something we know it's a high cost item. We know that it bleeds through to the cost of everything else. And we know it's a cost, it's particularly high for households that are commuting to work or lower income households. So government should be investing in helping people switch away from fossil fuels. So making it more affordable, investing in public transit, making it more reliable, more frequent, more affordable, we have been investing in electric vehicles. That's obviously not the only answer here. And at the municipal level, making 15-minute communities. So you don't need to, you can walk in your community, you don't actually need to community. So different levels of government have different responsibilities here, but I think that they should all be thinking about how can we transfer off fossil fuels more quickly because that price isn't going down.
Okay, so I mean, some of these are longer term solutions, but what I guess you're also saying is that the current crisis is a time to really start thinking about these seriously. I have three questions that have come in from the audience, and I'm going to place them to you. And again, quick answers, please. First to you, Angela. Okay. What happens with all the accumulated wealth of the boomers to help pay for the fewer workers covering more retirees?
Yeah, that's a problem. Hey, so that creates actually intergenerational wealth inequality. So those boomers tend to pass that money on to their kids,
True.
and their houses have increased dramatically in price. Ian talked about his house that he bought in the Glebe. I bet it's $1 million or $2 million now. So it's an extreme amount of wealth that has accumulated
As we
because of
discuss Ian's entire private life.
yeah, sorry.
We might
Ian
as well
brought it into the
discuss it.
conversation.
True.
But he's not the only one. He's not the only one. There's a whole bunch of people who, because prices and incomes were different then, even though inflation was at 20%, you weren't paying as much for a house. So it actually, balances out a little bit. It's harder to get that house now that gets you access to financing to do to get your foot into this kind of market that is a whole different world. So yeah, those boomers have that money. The other problem is, or some boomers have that money. Some boomers can afford to pay for private options outside of the public system. So I'm concerned about increasing two-tiered healthcare system where we haven't invested in our long-term care system, we haven't invested in our healthcare system, and the people who have the money and their kids are able to pay for these things and they get good quality care, but it just leads to a continued underinvestment for the rest of us. So that's a real concern about that concentration of wealth and the types of political decisions that it will influence. Who gets listened to?
Put a footnote to that, what Angela just said. Very quickly, I agree with mostly what Angela said. The concern I hear, and I hear it from young people, look at all that wealth. There's a huge amount of wealth. The majority of the national personal household wealth in Canada is held by older people. No question about it. But I did a paper with Professor B.J. Jog, Chancellor Professor at Carleton, about 4 years ago on the pension plan system, and we argued that the three-pillar model is really a four-pillar model. We didn't disagree with OAS, GIS, CPP, and employer pensions. What we said was the fourth pillar is home ownership, because large numbers of Canadians, and 70% of Canadians own their home. A large numbers of Canadians who are not in the top quintile and have stocks and bonds and so forth, use that equity in their tax-free principal residence to subsidize their retirement. So it is part of the pension system. So that question that came in from the audience, what about those people, and how are us younger workers going to pay for you older workers that don't have good enough pensions? The answer is they supplement a lot of people with modest incomes, but who bought 30, 40 years ago. So as Angela's correct, their house has gone up phenomenally, and they're using that. And I have tons of anecdotal, including my own family, of people who've done that. It's downsized from a bigger house to a smaller house outside of the city, out in the edges, smaller villages, and use that money to subsidize themselves in retirement.
Okay, Karim, I have the next question for you. We need affordable houses, but what about predatory investors buying up cheap housing to exploit as rental properties and repress those low-income individuals, families who are unable to own their own homes?
Right. I've never ever supported restrictions on ownership other than, oh, sorry, was that for me?
No, it was for Karim.
I apologize. Sorry.
No, Ian finish and then I'll react.
Okay, quickly, Ian.
Very quickly. We don't regulate. These are houses an asset class, just like stocks, bonds, Bitcoin's an asset class, collectible art, antique cars, and so forth. We've never regulated, other than some provinces have said, if you're a foreigner, you can't come in. I don't even agree with that, because I think that's discrimination, subtle discrimination against other nationalities and minorities. But we don't start picking and choosing who can buy which asset class. You can buy an old car that's valuable, but you can't. And I hope we never do that. If we want to look after affordability, we do it through the income support system, and we give additional support through whether it's called a negative income tax or that kind of government assistance. You don't start regulating who can buy the asset.
Karim.
I think the underlying policy question here that sometimes gets a bit distorted is the thing that people are actually upset about is who is a good landlord. And I don't yet know if we have enough good evidence that correlates ownership type. I think it's really important to investigate. On the campaign trail recently, I heard lots of stories of the attempts to convert or to roll up adjoining properties, or to convert properties, or that properties were acquired towards some sounded like it was a bad purpose in the eyes of the tenants or in the eyes of the local community. So I think it's something we really need to pay attention to. We also need to recognize that in some cases, those private equity outfits or those REITs are primarily owned by Canadian pension funds. So we can't be too hypocritical and just we want to cast them out, and actually this is but we also want them to invest in Canada, and this happens to be the asset class they chose to invest in Canada. So I think it's really important to get some more data on. I would also think that there is a cause here, a bit of a let's say a bit of a patriotic call out here. Are people who have because they already have access to credit, or because they're, like Ian was saying, they perhaps have already paid off their mortgage, perhaps people who are already have these assets, what's the next step in their investment journey? Do they want to create rental situations within their housing? That's something we should be encouraging.
Can I just
we
step
want to
in?
encourage them to be buying locally instead of buying the Florida condo, frankly.
No,
there are policies that can encourage that. Sorry, Angela wants to get on this.
30 seconds.
Housing is not any asset. Housing is a necessity. Housing is a human right, just like food is a human right. And so I think what people aren't, they don't like bad landlords, absolutely. But what they're upset about is that somebody is using their housing that they need, as an investment asset. That's what people are mad about. And they're able to do it because they have access to the financing that we don't have the ability to do. And that access to financing is driven by rent prices. And so if they can make more money selling it as rent, that sets a bar for the price of the home that is way above. We've seen Canadian home prices go up, and that's because of this financialization. That's because that house is worth more to me as an investment property than it is to the economy as used for a young family who needs that housing. And it's actually more affordable for them to do it. So I think it's because we've mixed up housing and what kind of asset it is. It should not be a financial asset. We should not be incentivizing it to be a financial asset. It is a human right. It is a necessity. And as governments have stopped building deeply affordable housing, there is nowhere for people to live that it's deeply affordable because it's not a profit. You can't get a profit out of providing that. That's the problem.
I just asked Karim if you finished your thought.
I guess I want to know who the landlords are going to be.
Exactly.
And I think we can imagine. I think we can imagine a world in which, with some policy moves, that we actually encourage landlords to be our neighbors.
I think the way we do that is through nonprofit and co-op housing. That's how we incentivize that. It should not be a profit-driven enterprise. I don't care if you're a nice landlord. It should not be profit-driven. It's a human right.
We're going to nationalize all rental buildings.
Non-profit and co-op. That's not nationalization, Ian, and you know it.
No, I'm talking the existing privately owned buildings, of which there are thousands and thousands. Are we going to nationalize them all? Take them over? Buy them out? Private landlords?
Are you suggesting a combination in the market, Angela, of public and private?
Absolutely. I'm saying that what governments should be doing right now is what the government of Nova Scotia is doing, is that have a fund available so that when properties come on the market, these houses that are run down, that are ripe for being built, that the government buys it and offers it at a low cost to not-for-profit or co-op housing to build and develop.
Okay.
There are lots of options that we can go to that aren't market driven, and I think the problem right now is there's too much market driven housing and there's not enough.
We're out of time, but we've talked about so many things. You've clarified some things and you've confused us completely on other things, and that's fair. That is what the economy is. I'm going to ask you, each of you, to take 30 seconds and just say, what is the one thing that people should be watching for in the next few months? Because people are really thinking about the next few months. And I'll start with you, Ian Lee. The next few months, just one thing that people should be watching in terms of.
Keep your eye like a laser beam on the speeches of Governor Macklem, who is a very intelligent, very experienced central banker, And I think he is running he is the inflation czar in Canada today, not the Prime Minister, not the Minister of Finance. Read every speech he offers, read his monetary policy reports, because he is going to be determining where the economy is going through interest rates over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months well into 2023.
Okay, Angela, your one thought for what people should be watching.
So I want to see what governments do to ameliorate the impacts of both inflation and interest rate increases. I want to see if they are helping people at the low end. I want provinces to be inflation adjusting benefits like social assistance, like any of those benefits that provinces often, because the federal government does inflation adjust benefits, but the provinces mostly don't. I want to see if they are helping people transfer away from oil and gas. I want to see who they're subsidizing and who they're not. Who's
Okay,
in those
thank you.
making,
Karim,
life more affordable for us.
I want to see in early September. I want to see the in-person public school enrollments, because I wonder how many people are choosing private options. I wonder how many people are still worried about the prospect of the pandemic reappearing in the school system. And I want to see, frankly, where people are now making decisions perhaps to relocate, to be closer to caregiving supports.
Okay.
And that will create some kinds of interesting effects on public school enrollments.
Yeah. Okay, we have gone over time, but I do have one other quick question for you, which is a different topic. You've all been candidates for political office. I'm sure you're the positive and negatives, but can you just share with us one really good thing you found about running that you encourage other people to run? If the sentence was, I enjoyed running because, and I'll start with you, Karim, since you just did it.
I enjoyed running because it put me in dialogue with tens of thousands of people, unmediated from what we are told they think.
Angela, what?
Absolutely. I love talking to people on the doorstep and hearing their stories. And often I see why people don't trust government right now, because they're falling through the cracks. And so as a policy nerd, finding out how the system is broken by talking to people on the doorstep and thinking about how we can design a better system to make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks. I love that.
Thank you. And Ian, your thought about why you enjoyed running.
It was a long time ago, a third of a century ago, but I'm more convinced today than I was then of what Professor Lindblom at Yale University, the late Professor Lindblom, called the intelligence of democracy. The intelligence in a democracy does not lie in the Laurentian elites, in the Washington or New York or Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal bubble. I believe there's an incredible amount of intelligence. I'm not talking highly formalized PhD in political philosophy from Oxford. I mean a common sense understanding of the economy, of inflation, of what's going on in the country. The ordinary Canadians are not dummies. They are, just because they're not highly educated does not mean they do not understand. And I'm somebody who grew up in rural Eastern Ontario, which is not known as the source of enrollment for Harvard University. And there's a lot of really good people there. And I've been all across Canada in rural parts and in the States. And you get into the rural parts and into the urban parts, suburban parts, excuse me. There's an intelligence in democracy that has not, I think, has been trivialized in the last 10, 15 years.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the discussion on the economy. But I also want to say, as a Canadian, thank you to each of you for putting your names forward and running for public office, because that is how our system works. And win or lose, you really add a lot to it. And I think we got a lot of your intelligence in terms of the economy, but also got a little bit of intelligence that you learned at the doorstep. And thank you for that. I just want to remind our audience that the next event that we have is the Pearson Leadership Gala, which will take place in Toronto on September the 13th. And we've got various other webinars and meetings planned for the fall session. So please join us again. Thank you to Angela MacEwen, Karim Bardeesy, and Ian Lee for spending some time with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.